In the world of concrete and steel, they called him the preacher. He walked the yard with a Bible, not a weapon, a quiet black man focused on faith, redemption, and counting down the days. The other inmates, especially Reaper and his white gang, saw this piety not as conviction, but as an open invitation. Faith is a weakness that predators will always exploit. The preacher stood against the cold brick wall of the yard, dressed in the standard issue blue uniform, watching the chaos with the measured awareness of someone who had commanded far greater chaos. They just didn't know whose faith they were testing. Before we get into how a man of God became a weapon of controlled destruction, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss our next story of justice and giving voice to the voiceless. The exercise yard at Blackgate Federal Penitentiary stretched out under a pale, unforgiving sun. The air was thick with the metallic tang of chain link, the stale smell of concrete, and the ever-present low hum of suppressed violence. The convert stood near the perimeter fence, his back against a cold brick wall, a solitary figure in the chaotic geometry of the prison landscape. His demeanor was one of profound stillness. He moved with a quiet, efficient grace that belied his surroundings. At 42, his physical conditioning remained flawless. Lean muscle, controlled breathing, a posture that suggested readiness without aggression. He wore the standard issue blue uniform, but unlike many inmates who wore their uniforms like rags, his was neat, the shirt tucked, the creases sharp. He'd been at Blackgate for 6 weeks, serving an 18-month sentence for aggravated assault. The irony tasted like ash in his mouth. 2 decades defending his country across every dusty, dangerous corner of the world as a Delta Force commander, only to end up here. The charge? Excessive force. He had intervened to protect a woman being brutally assaulted outside a bar in Philadelphia, using the skills his country had paid millions to hone. The legal system called it excessive force. He called it doing what was necessary. The 3 men attacking the woman had stopped when he intervened, and they'd spent weeks in the hospital as a result. His lawyer had argued self-defense and defense of others, but the prosecutor, fearing the optics of a highly trained black veteran putting 3 white assailants in intensive care, had successfully taunted the convert as a dangerous man unable to adjust to civilian life, someone whose military training had made him a threat to public order. He thought constantly of his daughter, Nina, and his young grandson. He had made her a promise. "I'll do my time quietly. No trouble. I'll be home soon." This promise was his shield and his deepest vulnerability. Every prayer he offered was a plea for the strength to keep that promise, to avoid the violence that he was physically and mentally programmed to master. He had traded his tactical skills for a Bible, his weapon for faith. He was a ghost in the system, and that fact alone marked him for trouble. He felt the heavy, intimidating presence before he saw them. Reaper. Reaper was the apex predator of Blackgate, the unchallenged leader of the white supremacist gang known simply as the Crew. A man built on intimidation, over 6 feet tall, with a massive tattooed frame that filled out the prison blue uniform like a sack of iron. He saw the prison as his kingdom, and he ruled through fear and exploitation. Reaper had watched the convert for days. He watched him read the Bible during recreation. He watched him sit alone at meals. He watched him refuse to align, refuse to fight, refuse to pay the usual protection taxes. To Reaper, the convert's quiet strength was an insult. His piety was a direct challenge to the supremacy of violence. Today, Reaper had decided the insult had lasted long enough. The gang leader approached with his shadow, 5 other men, all large, all bearing the subtle, crude signs of their affiliation, swaggering with the confidence of untouchable power. They surrounded the perimeter of the area, cutting off the convert's escape routes in a deliberate, staged maneuver. The convert closed the thin, worn paperback copy of his Bible, setting it carefully beside him on the cold stone bench. He looked up at Reaper, his face calm, his deep-set eyes observing every twitch and shift in the 6-man formation. The preacher was about to be put to the test, and his enemy, steeped in arrogance, was entirely unaware that he had just cornered the one man on the yard who could end him in under 15 seconds. The righteous vindication he sought was about to collide violently with his moral restraint. The quiet war was about to explode. The convert had been monitoring the gang for days, reading the script of their movements like a poorly written, violent play he had already committed to memory. He understood their patterns of intimidation, the timing of their shakedowns, and the precise moment their leader, Reaper, would decide to make his move. That moment was now. Reaper stopped a few feet away, his huge shadow falling over the convert's blue prison uniform, darkening the pages of the open Bible beside him. The gang leader was an undeniable physical force, a wall of aggression covered in crude, hateful ink. His eyes, devoid of intelligence but full of predatory certainty, held a look of utter disdain. It was the look of a man who saw faith as a disability and the quiet dignity of a black man as a territory dispute. "Looks like we got a preacher man out here," Reaper drawled, his voice thick and contemptuous, loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding inmates. He made sure the yard was watching. "Don't usually see your kind running solo, preacher. Everything in this yard's got a group, a clique, a test, except you." The convert kept his expression flat, his deep-set eyes observing the 6 men in a quick, rotational scan, noting the distance between them, the proximity of the nearest guard tower, futile, and the nearest solid object, the wall behind him. The analysis was automatic, a ghost of the Delta Force planning cycle running beneath the surface of his calm. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead, but his primary directive was still de-escalation. "I prefer solitude," the convert stated, his voice low, steady, and entirely devoid of fear. "And I'm not running anything. I'm just trying to serve my time and go home." Reaper laughed, a short barking sound that held no humor. "Go home? You think reading that thing gets you a shortcut, boy? This yard runs on respect and you ain't paid none. Bear by him. You pray when you should be paying, and that makes you a problem." The escalation was predictable. The tension became a physical thing, drawing the inmates closer, eager for the show. Reaper's second in command, a wiry man with scars, stepped closer to the bench and deliberately nudged the Bible, sending it sliding toward the concrete. The convert's hand twitched, the muscle memory firing 1,000 defensive possibilities. He forced himself to remain still. That book was his sanctuary, but losing his temper over it was exactly what Reaper wanted. He held his moral restraint like a shield. "Pick it up," the convert commanded, his tone quiet but carrying a dangerous edge that belied his clerical nickname. The second-in-command froze, momentarily startled by the abrupt shift in authority. Reaper quickly covered the lapse, his aggressive demeanor masking the sudden curiosity about this quiet inmate. "You got heart, preacher. I'll give you that," Reaper sneered, closing the gap. "But heart don't pay taxes. You either join us, or you pay us. Or you walk the yard knowing that every corner, every shower, every meal, we own it, and we own you." He used his bulk to crowd the convert, leaning in close, attempting to invade his personal space and break his composure with sheer intimidation. This was the tipping point. The threat was no longer abstract. It was imminent and designed to humiliate. The preacher knew that to submit now would mean the end of his quiet sentence and the acceptance of permanent victimization. He met Reaper's stare, his deep-set eyes reflecting the cold, hard certainty of his past life. He wouldn't give in, and he wouldn't fight first. He would be forced. "I am not yours to own," the convert said, standing slowly. His movement was fluid, deliberate, bringing him face to face with the towering gang leader. "I am here to find peace. I advise you to walk away and find your own." Reaper's lips stretched into a cruel, knowing smile. He had his stage, and the target was right where he wanted him. He raised a massive, scarred fist, knowing the blow would be the final, crushing answer to the inmate's misplaced faith. The game was over. The violence was about to begin. The convert felt the pressure long before Reaper opened his mouth. It was a subtle, physical sensation. The change in air quality as 6 bodies moved with predatory purpose, cutting off the natural flow of the yard. They had followed him from the communal hall after evening chow, their heavy boots loud on the cracked asphalt. The preacher had retreated to the basketball court, a space usually ignored in the late afternoon chill, choosing a spot near the chain-link perimeter where 2 towers could observe the area. It was a defensive choice, made by habit, not malice. He set his Bible down on a worn, paint-flecked bleacher and turned slowly to face them. Reaper stopped 5 feet away, his massive frame blocking the last rays of the fading light. His blue uniform shirt was open at the collar, exposing thick, pale skin and crude, faded tattoos. Reaper didn't need to speak to convey threat. He simply breathed, and the hostility filled the space. His 5 crew members formed a casual yet impenetrable semicircle behind him. "Well, look here," Reaper drawled, his voice a low, gravelly sound that carried just far enough to command attention without alerting the distant guards. The preacher done found himself a quiet spot to talk to his imaginary friend. The convert remained still. His deep-set eyes, trained for decades to process threats like data points, locked onto Reaper's. He registered the slight tremor in Reaper's left hand, a tell of adrenaline mixed with anticipation. "I prefer solitude," the convert stated, his voice calm, pitched low, and utterly devoid of fear. It was the voice of a man giving an order, not pleading for mercy. "There's space enough for everyone at Blackgate, Reaper. Walk away." A slow, ugly smile spread across Reaper's face. "Walk away? See, that's where you got it wrong, boy. You don't tell me where to walk. And you don't get solitude. Not when you're here, and especially not when you're wearing that uniform." Reaper gestured contemptuously toward the Bible on the bench. "And that little book? That tells me you're weak. Faith in here is a disease, preacher. It's something we stomp out." The tension tightened. The convert knew this wasn't about the Bible. It was about dominance. His mere refusal to submit or affiliate had challenged Reaper's authority in the silent, violent contract of the prison. "I am not interested in your politics," the convert replied, shifting his weight just enough to brace himself. His mind ran a silent sequence. 2 outside, 2 flank, 1 center mass, 1 rear cover. 6 targets, all predictable in movement. Goal, non-lethal incapacitation. It was the silent assessment of a professional. Reaper took a step closer, crowding the convert's personal space. He reached out a thick, sausage-like finger and poked the man hard in the chest. "Wrong answer. You pay your dues or you pay with pain. And you've been reading too much to pay either one, so we'll start collecting now." The poke quickly became a hard, open-handed shove. The convert's head snapped back slightly, but his feet did not move. He consciously relaxed his shoulders, absorbing the impact. His training screamed for immediate response, for a disarm and a takedown, but his moral code held tight. "Not yet, I promised." He needed the provocation to be undeniable, for the line of self-defense to be crossed visibly, even if only to his own conscience. "This is your final warning," the convert said, his voice dropping another octave. He saw Reaper's fist clench and draw back, ready for the first real blow. "Leave this place." Reaper laughed, a short, vicious bark. "Warning, you got the right words, preacher, but you got the wrong audience." The next moment was a blur of calculated violence. Reaper's fist connected with the side of the convert's jaw. The impact was heavy and jarring, but the convert rode the blow, ensuring it glanced rather than landed flush. He staggered back, seemingly disoriented, deliberately allowing the crew to close in. "Get him!" Reaper roared, seeing the blood trickling from the convert's lip and mistaking restraint for defeat. 2 of the flanking men rushed in, grabbing the convert's arms and pinning them against the chain-link fence. Another wrapped his massive arm around the convert's neck in a crude chokehold. It was a classic street-level restraint, designed to hold the victim while the leader delivered the punishment. The preacher was immobilized, helpless, his back pressed against the cold metal, his breath catching in his throat. This was the line. When they restrained him, they made his non-violent exit impossible. They had taken his choice. A fierce, ancient light ignited in the convert's eyes. Reaper stood before him, drawing his leg back for a devastating hick. Reaper never saw the shift. The convert had endured the provocation, sought peace until the last second, and now the professional had permission to take over. The voice that echoed in his mind was not of prayer, but of lethal calculation. Restraint terminated. The air in the recreation yard of Blackgate Federal Penitentiary grew cold despite the late afternoon sun. The convert remained by the perimeter, the weight of 6 hostile men bearing down on him. The other inmates, sensing the shift in the social dynamic, quickly dispersed, their movements betraying a calculated eagerness for the inevitable violence and a clear understanding of the hierarchy being challenged. No one dared to intervene. The only audience was the guard tower, far above, which might or might not look away when the time came. Reaper stepped forward, his massive frame eclipsing the light. His eyes, small and cold beneath a heavy brow, were fixed on the convert's chest, not his face. "The preacher," Reaper rumbled, the name a sneer on his lips. "You've been here 6 weeks, reading that little book, acting like you too holy for the dirt we walk on. You owe me." The convert met his gaze. His deep-set eyes, usually reflecting a weary calm, were now intensely focused, not in anger but in calculation. His mind was running through scenarios, not biblical verses. He saw the flanking positions of the crew, the distance to the wall, the sightline of the nearest guard. "I owe you nothing, Reaper," the convert said, his voice low, even, and entirely devoid of fear. "I keep my space, I follow the rules. I'm just here to serve my time and leave in peace." "Peace," Reaper spat, moving closer. "Peace is for the graveyard. This yard runs on respect, and you ain't shown me none. You stand alone? That makes you weak, and weak pays the toll." Reaper lifted his hand and slapped the convert across the face with an open palm. The sharp, dull crack echoed across the now silent yard. The convert's head snapped sideways. A dark red mark instantly bloomed on his cheekbone. The pain was sharp, but the shock was internal. He tasted blood on his tongue. Every fiber of his being, every synapse trained over 20 years in the world's most elite counterterrorism units, screamed for immediate, devastating retaliation. Reaper's move was an insult, a test, and a physical act of aggression demanding an instant response. But the voice of his daughter, Nana, echoed louder than the combat imperative. "Stay out of trouble. Just come home." He took a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze moving from the ground back to Reaper's triumphant, aggressive face. He consciously shifted his weight, loosening his shoulders, overriding the muscle memory that wanted to lock down and attack. Restraint was his current weapon, his penance for the excessive force conviction that had landed him here. "Take your men and walk away, Reaper," he warned, his voice tighter this time, a tremor of the coiled spring audible in the tone. "This is not worth the risk for you." Reaper let out a short, guttural laugh. He loved the fear and weakness he thought he heard. "You going to pray me away, preacher?" He stepped in and delivered a heavy punch to the convert's ribs. It was a blunt, powerful blow from a man who relied on weight and bulk. The convert grunted, stumbling back into the brick wall, the pain radiating through his side. The blue fabric of his uniform absorbed the impact, but the internal damage was real. He felt a deep, terrible sadness. He had failed his daughter's wish for a quiet sentence the moment he allowed himself to be hit. His patience was at its limit. Reaper's men, sensing victory, surged forward. Two pinned the convert's shoulders against the wall. A third grabbed his legs. "We ain't praying, preacher," Reaper snarled, raising his fist for a sustained beating. "We're giving you your redemption." In that second, immobilized and staring into the face of raw, arrogant hatred, the moral calculus flipped. The promise to Nana was broken anyway. He was now officially in a fight. The internal struggle ceased. The moral necessity of defending himself against 6 assailants who now intended grievous harm overrode the spiritual obligation to suffer. He wasn't just defending himself. He was defending the small, quiet space he had carved out for his faith. He realized that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not turning the other cheek, but standing up to evil. The convert's deep-set eyes, which had held the quiet weariness of a man seeking peace, now narrowed. The weariness was gone, replaced by a cold, immediate clarity. The Delta Force commander was back online. He looked at the fist descending toward his face and knew exactly what had to be done. The air in the exercise yard cracked, the sound swallowed immediately by the surrounding concrete. The gang's 6-man formation tightened, closing the ring on the preacher. Reaper stood chest to chest with him, breathing stale air and hate onto his face. The preacher had taken the previous hit to the chest, a heavy, punishing blow that had made his breath hitch, but he hadn't moved his feet. An act of defiance more unnerving than any challenge. Now 2 of Reaper's men, A bulky inmate named Ghost and a wiry, unpredictable man called Shank moved to flank him. The time for restraint was over. They had crossed the line, not just of physical assault, but of moral sanctity, believing his faith meant surrender. "You done praying, preacher?" Reaper snarled, the question laced with the promise of pain. The two flanking men grabbed the preacher's arms, their intent clear. Immobilize the target, then the gang leader delivers the message. As their hands clamped down, the preacher's calm facade didn't break. But something deep inside, the carefully locked away switchboard of 2 decades of special operations training, flipped. It wasn't rage that surged through him. It was pure, cold calculation. The man of God vanished, replaced instantly by the master operator. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a tactical problem with 6 hostile targets in one single non-lethal solution. The hidden power was revealed. In the quiet focus of his mind, the noise of the yard faded. Everything slowed. He didn't see 6 opponents. He saw points of leverage, flaws in their stance, and predictable vectors of attack. He hated what he had to do, but as Ghost attempted to twist his arm behind his back, the decision crystallized. He remembered the promise to his family, but he also remembered the vow he'd made to himself. He would not be a victim. He would not let cruelty win. His voice, barely above a whisper, was directed at the sky, a final, chilling declaration. "I asked God for forgiveness once. I can ask again." The action that followed was executed with terrifying, competent satisfaction. It began with an impossible, hyper-efficient move. Using the momentum of Ghost's pull, the preacher dropped his weight, simultaneously twisting his elbow inward against the joint and slamming the heel of his blue prison boot down onto the arch of Ghost's foot. The excruciating sudden pain, a non-lethal neurological shock, made Ghost bellow and instantly release the arm. In that same blink, the preacher pivoted, using the now free arm to deliver a lightning-fast open palm strike beneath Shank's ear. Shank's eyes rolled back, and he slumped forward, neutralized before he even hit the ground. 2 men down in 1 second. Reaper, stunned by the sudden professional efficiency, threw a wild, heavy punch. The preacher didn't duck. He simply leaned back a few inches, allowing the blow to rush past his ear, generating a forward momentum he immediately exploited. His hand shot out, not to punch, but to grab Reaper's shirt collar and pull the massive man past him. As Reaper stumbled, the preacher drove his knee into the gang leader's solar plexus with a sharp, controlled thrust. The sound of the wind rushing out of Reaper's lungs was sickeningly loud. Reaper collapsed, unable to breathe, his bulk temporarily useless. The remaining 3 attackers moved in a desperate attempt to overwhelm him. The preacher met them with fluid, seamless transitions. A sweeping low kick tripped the first man. As the second rushed forward, he used the man's momentum against him, guiding the rush straight into the wall with a forearm shivered to the chest that didn't break bone, but ensured a moment of blinding disorientation. The final man, drawing a crude shiv, froze. He watched the peaceful black man, now breathing in sharp, focused gasps, adopt a low, coiled defensive stance, the posture of a man who dealt in death and was perfectly ready to do so again. It had taken less than 15 seconds. 6 men lay immobilized, subdued by calculated, crippling pain, but crucially, alive. The preacher stood alone, the Bible still resting untouched on the bench, a testament to the moral restraint he had been forced to break. The yard, moments before a cacophony of sound, had fallen into an absolute disbelieving silence. The conversion had been tested, and the consequences of the failure of peace were now scattered at his feet. The violence had not lasted long enough to be called a brawl. It was a demonstration, a cold, surgical dismantling executed by a master craftsman. Now the silence that fell over the Blackgate yard was far heavier than the sound of the confrontation it had been. 6 men, 600 pounds of muscle and hate, including the monolithic figure of Reaper, were scattered across the concrete, neutralized. They were not bleeding, they were weeping in silent agony, unable to move, their knees, shoulders, and elbows held in unforgiving, non-lethal joint locks. The convert stood perfectly still over Reaper, his chest heaving only slightly. He was breathing the controlled rhythm of a professional coming down from a high-stakes kinetic event. He retrieved his Bible from the bench, brushing the dust from the worn cover as he looked down at the gang leader, whose face was buried in the concrete, sobbing not from pain, but from the sudden, total loss of his tyrannical power. Then came the sirens, not the alarm siren, but the frantic, piercing whistle of the correctional officers' whistles, followed by the heavy, measured thudding of boots. Two squads of guards, led by Deputy Warden Hayes, converged on the perimeter, their faces tight with confusion. They had seen violence, but they had never seen a scene of such total, lopsided control. Hayes, a man who measured his prison by the dominance of its gangs, stared at the sight of Reaper, the undisputed king of the yard, reduced to a whimpering mess by the quiet black inmate they all called the preacher. "What in God's name happened here?" Hayes demanded, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. The convert simply stood back, his hands held open, palms visible, a posture of non-aggression despite the controlled chaos he had just inflicted. "Self-defense, Deputy Warden. Am unharmed." Before Hayes could bark orders, a voice cut through the commotion, a voice carrying the unmistakable tone of military authority and command. A man in a dark, expensive suit, flanked by two federal marshals, strode purposefully onto the yard. "Hold your position, Deputy Warden," the newcomer ordered, his eyes locked onto the convert. He was Lieutenant Colonel Chen, attached to the Department of Defense Liaison Office. Chen approached the convert, ignoring the guards and the injured men. He performed a swift, professional visual assessment. "Report, Commander," Chen said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a secure channel. The convert met his gaze, the quiet intensity in his eyes flickering with a deeper, more lethal light. "Threat neutralized, Colonel. Non-lethal force applied. Restraint protocols were violated, requiring an escalated response." The exchange, spoken in a language of military shorthand, stunned the prison officials. Hayes stammered, "Commander? Who?" Chen turned slowly, his face grim and utterly serious. "Warden Morrison is aware of the situation. This inmate, the convert, is not simply serving a term for assault. He is a former Delta Force commander, 20 years of continuous service, multiple highly classified deployments. His record is sealed above your clearance level. He just exercised the kind of controlled, lethal competence he was trained for." The revelation landed like a depth charge. Reaper, hearing the words, stopped, whimpering, replaced by a profound, cold terror. The preacher was not a pacifist. He was a coiled viper who had chosen peace. The consequences were immediate and absolute. Within the hour, Reaper and his 5 associates were escorted directly to the Special Housing Unit, SHU. The humiliation of their defeat, coupled with the systemic chaos they had invited, ensured they would remain isolated indefinitely. The gang's dominance in the yard was shattered, replaced by the rumor of the man who prayed for peace but fought like a ghost. The convert, however, was also taken away. Despite the clear ruling of self-defense, Hayes determined that the preacher's presence on the general population yard now constituted an unacceptable security risk to every other inmate and staff member. He was transferred to a secure unit, separated from the general population, protective custody. As the cell door of the isolation unit clanged shut, the convert settled onto the thin mattress. His body was already beginning the slow decompression. He had kept his promise to Nana for 6 weeks, but in 15 terrifying seconds, the needs of righteousness had overridden the needs of safety. He was locked away, isolated, but he was also safe. And for the first time since his arrival, every single man in Blackgate Penitentiary, from the lowest inmate to the highest-ranking warden, knew exactly who they were dealing with. The quiet war was over, but the national reckoning was just beginning. The roar of the yard died with the snap of Reaper's elbow. One moment, the air was electric with the expectation of a brutal gang beating. The next, the sound was nothing but the ragged, wet breathing of 6 men lying prone, incapacitated with surgical precision. The convert stood over them, his chest heaving, the blue uniform vibrating with residual kinetic energy, but his expression was already settling back into that unnerving calm. He slowly retrieved his Bible from the bench, brushing dust from the cover before tucking it under his arm. The war had lasted 15 seconds. The immediate arrival of COs, spurred by the chaotic silence, was frantic. They found the gang leader and his crew broken but conscious, none bearing life-threatening injuries, but all suffering from expertly targeted joint trauma. The convert offered no resistance, simply presenting his wrists for cuffs, his eyes meeting the CO's with a level, non-aggressive intensity that chilled the officer to the bone. Within the hour, he was seated in Warden Morrison's office, a stark, wood-paneled space that felt miles removed from the concrete hell of Blackgate Federal Penitentiary. Across from him sat Warden Morrison, rigid and furious, and next to him a man in a crisp army dress uniform, Lieutenant Colonel Chen, a military liaison, who had been on site for a routine visit. "I was told you were a quiet convert focusing on your faith," Morrison growled, slamming a thick folder onto the desk. "I was not told you were a former Delta Force commander, a man trained in every known application of controlled, lethal force." Lieutenant Colonel Chen stepped in, his voice low and professional, cutting through the warden's anger. "Sir, his records were flagged for minimal contact, maximum security risk. He didn't want his history known, but once he was cornered, that training is muscle memory." His response was a non-lethal neutralization of 6 assailants in under 15 seconds. Based on the video, he never aimed for the head, heart, or throat. He disabled them. He responded to a threat that you had failed to contain. The warden rubbed his temples, already seeing the endless paperwork and the inevitable media fallout. "He nearly broke 2 men's necks." "He chose not to," Chen corrected flatly. "That, Warden, is the difference between a fighter and a commander. He controlled his output. It was justified self-defense." Morrison slammed his hand on the desk, resigned. "Fine. Reaper and his crew are transferred to the Special Housing Unit immediately pending external investigation. The convert goes into protective custody tonight. I don't need this hanging over my facility." The ruling was immediate. No added time for the convert. His action was ruled as necessary self-defense, stemming from gang provocation. It was a victory, but it came at the cost of his quiet sentence. He was now the most infamous inmate in the prison. Untouchable, but isolated. The news broke nationally the next day. The story, The Preacher's Secret, Quiet Inmates Delta Force Past Exposed During Prison Brawl, went viral. The narrative shifted instantly from a prison fight to a commentary on the unjust incarceration of combat veterans, forced into hostile environments and then punished for deploying the skills they were trained to use. His original conviction for excessive force suddenly looked like a profound miscarriage of justice when viewed through the lens of a prison yard confrontation. The incident triggered an internal review of his original case by the State Attorney General's office. Furthermore, Lieutenant Colonel Chen immediately began quietly petitioning high-level military contacts and federal officials, assembling a formidable defense team focused on a single objective: clemency. The moral weight of the convert's restraint, followed by his controlled defense, had changed the entire system around him in a single violent moment. The convert was led to the isolation wing, a place where he was safe from retribution, but wholly alone. He was now a symbol, a case study, and the accidental catalyst for justice reform. He sat down on his cot, the only sound the quiet metallic hum of the isolation unit, and pulled out his Bible. The final test of his faith had passed, but the final test of his conviction, what he would do with this newfound platform, was just beginning. The silence of the protective custody unit was a profound, suffocating contrast to the thunder of the yard. The convert sat on his cot, the memory of the 15-second confrontation still sharp in his muscle memory. The speed, the precision, the sheer absence of wasted effort, it was terrifyingly familiar. He was safe, yet utterly alone, paying the price for the controlled destruction he had unleashed. But here, in this sterile, quiet cell, he allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He had kept his vow to his family by choosing to defend himself, but he had done more than just survive. Word filtered up the chain through the sympathetic guards and occasional chaplain visits. Reaper's empire had crumbled. The transfer to the Special Housing Unit, SHU, had severed the head of the organization, but the manner of their defeat, the quick, clean, humiliating dismantling, by the man they called the preacher, had shattered their mystique entirely. The fear that had kept Blackgate Federal Penitentiary in check for years had evaporated overnight, replaced by a new, reluctant respect for the convert. He hadn't sought power, but by demonstrating his hidden power revealed, he had inadvertently achieved system correction within the yard's ruthless hierarchy. The men who had preyed on the weak now kept their heads down, knowing there was a new, unpredictable standard of consequence. The national attention was less subtle. The warden's report, confirming the use of justified force by a former Delta Force commander, had been leaked. News segments, op-eds, and veteran advocacy groups were now using his story as a rallying cry. They weren't focused on the prison fight. They focused on the injustice of his initial conviction. The core of their argument was the simple moral truth. A man who risks his life to defend an innocent civilian should not be penalized by the law for being effective. It was this sudden, overwhelming external pressure that gave the convert his new purpose. He started receiving letters, not just from legal aid organizations and clemency committees, but from other incarcerated veterans facing similar dilemmas. They wrote of choosing between violence and silence, between serving their country and serving time for their competence. He realized his forced action had become a beacon. Using the few resources available to him, he began corresponding, advising the veterans on how to document their struggles and connect with outside resources. His quiet war had expanded from a cell block defense to an unlikely fight for reform. Realizing his story was a powerful lever for the Veterans Self-Defense Clarification Act being debated nationally. Then came the envelope with the unfamiliar, graceful script. It was from the woman he had defended outside the Philadelphia bar, the one whose safety had cost him his freedom. He opened the letter with trembling hands, a mix of apprehension and deep fatigue settling over him. He had never expected to hear from her. She wrote about the fear, the horror of that night, and the moment he appeared, a silent, unstoppable force. She didn't dwell on his military past or the legal battle. She focused on the simple courage of his decision. She acknowledged the price he was paying, and she thanked him not just for saving her, but for teaching her that some principles, some acts of righteous vindication, were worth fighting for, even against overwhelming odds. She ended the letter promising to join the advocacy effort for his clemency. Reading her words, the convert felt the hard, tight knot in his chest finally loosen. He looked out the small, barred window at the sliver of sky. He had lost his freedom, but he hadn't lost his soul. The violence he had feared, the skills he had tried to bury, had ultimately served his moral compass. The Delta Force redemption was beginning, not with a bang, but with the quiet clarity of a written promise and the knowledge that, for once, justice, however messy, was finally moving in his direction. The official document arrived with the signature of the president, a single decisive piece of paper that undid 9 months of forced segregation. Clemency, commuted to time served. The paperwork was processed with the efficiency reserved for high-profile cases the system wanted quietly erased. Yet, for the convert, the transition from Blackgate Penitentiary to the outside world felt less like an erasure and more like an overdue vindication. He signed the final forms, shedding the blue uniform for simple civilian clothes, a profound visual symbol of the boundary he had crossed. He left nothing behind but the silence he had purchased with calculated violence. The sight of his daughter, Nina, waiting just beyond the gate was the true end of his sentence. She rushed him, tears flowing freely, burying her face in the chest of the man she had worried would be changed by the cage. But he was only refined. Holding her, he felt the immense weight of the moral burden finally lift. And then, there was his grandson, shyly holding Nina's hand, looking up at his grandfather, the preacher, with wide, curious eyes. The family was whole. His commitment, the impossible promise to stay out of trouble, had been kept in the only way it could have been, by facing necessary trouble head-on and surviving. His release wasn't the end of the story. It was the launching point for his legacy. The details of the yard fight, the 6 incapacitated men, the 15-second blur of non-lethal efficiency, the shocking reveal of his Delta Force past, had not vanished. Instead, they had become a national flashpoint, fueling a debate about veteran re-entry and the definition of self-defense. The public narrative shifted. He was no longer the criminal who used excessive force, but the righteous man whose competence was criminalized. This momentum led to the introduction of the Veterans Self-Defense Clarification Act. The convert, initially seeking only silence, found himself thrust into the role of an advocate. He traveled not back to the war zones of his past, but to legislative halls, his voice calm and deliberate, detailing how the system had failed him and how his forced act of redemption was a symptom of a larger problem. He argued that the experience of extreme threat demanded a different legal calculus for those trained to operate at the razor's edge. His quiet struggle for justice had become a blueprint for system correction. He often thought of the quiet yard after the fight, the sound of the Bible hitting the stone as he made his choice. That was the moment he realized his strength wasn't just in his training, but in his ability to choose whether or not to use it. The true power was not the violence he possessed, but the restraint he maintained until the moment God and necessity demanded action. Sitting on his porch months later, watching his grandson chase fireflies across the summer lawn, the sounds of the night were soft, a stark contrast to the clanging steel of Blackgate. He was home, free, and his life was dedicated to a new mission. His sentence had been commuted, his honor restored, and his faith solidified. The preacher had proven that righteousness was not weakness. It was the foundation upon which overwhelming power was built, and only when absolutely necessary, reluctantly deployed. His story was the quiet victory of a man who finally found peace by refusing to give up the fight for what was right. That man proved that true power isn't in what you will do, but in what you refuse to do. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous, not because they want to hurt you, but because they can and choose not to. That's real power. What other righteous men and women have been forced to become legends just to survive the system? Hit the like button if you agree that justice is more than just the law. Comment from her. You're watching from, and subscribe to see more stories of the hidden heroes fighting for their redemption behind bars.